All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Going to do another deep dive into philosophy with Tim Keefe today. We're going to do another delusional episode where we talk about Deleuze's thoughts on Solomon Maimon, if I have that pronunciation correct. It's another one of his monographs from the book called Deleuze's Philosophical Lineage by Graham Jones, and one of those monographs out of many different Deleuze's thoughts on many different philosophers that we've been going through. So, yeah, do you want to start off with a bit of an introduction as usual there, Tim?
Sure. So we're continuing with our delusional process, and just as one correction, Deleuze did not write a monograph on Solomon Maimon.
Oh, okay.
In fact, a lot of where he mentions Maimon is in difference and repetition, which we'll see in
Okay.
the essay as we're going through. But Maimon he's kind of an interesting character. He's obscure. Unless you really dig into the history of philosophy, you never heard of him.
Yeah, I remember them mentioning that in what you sent me about Solomon Maimon to read.
hmm Now, what's distinctive about Maimon is that he was Jewish, and his dates are
Right.
1753 to 1800. So he was living at the same time as Kant. Kant, I believe, died in 1805, somewhere in the early 19th century. And I was the other day I was listening to a lecture by a historian in New York. A Jewish historian who didn't cover the philosophy, but just covered Maimon himself. So Maimon actually taught himself. He was a huge autodidact. He taught himself German, but he never spoke it properly. And Kant, because this was later in his life, had said that Maimon was one of the few people who actually understood him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
It sounds like quite an accomplishment based
it
on
does.
what
Yeah,
we've heard so far.
yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, okay. So I won't go into Maimon's life details, but I will focus a little bit on what he had to say about Kant. And just as a retrospective. So last time we focused on Kant, and Kant is not an easy one to unpack.
Yeah.
So if you remember, we talked about uh, sensory intuition. What is an intuition? Is representation in the mind. The categories. Kant was more or less a synthesis between rationalism and empiricism, where he understood that we take in a lot of our knowledge through sense perception, but our senses can deceive us. But not everything comes through sense perception, as you would find in Radical Philosophy of Hume.
Yes.
But the rationalist part of it is that there are already categories that exist within the mind that give shape to our sensory perception.
Okay.
That's in a real simplistic nutshell.
Okay.
So I won't go too far into Kant's philosophy. The listeners can go to our previous episode. But there are some things that Maimon focuses on that I did not cover with Kant's philosophy the last time. And so one of these is the thing in itself, which in German is called the Ding an sich. This is an important concept within Kantian thought. And the thing in itself, Kant uses a Latin term, he calls it the noumenon, as distinct from the phenomenon.
Is that
So,
different from what is it, Numa or something like that too?
no, that's different.
Okay. That's a
Okay.
completely different thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So in consciousness, the phenomenon is what appears to us. Now, whatever it is we're looking at, an apple, a chair, a plane in the sky, a fellow person, or anything is. This is the phenomenon that appears to us in consciousness. But the thing in itself is something that's behind the phenomenon. So as Kant would say, we have these phenomena, but what undergirds it? I wouldn't necessarily say what essence it is, but you can think somewhere along the same lines. So the noumenon is something that he came up with that gives the thing, the phenomenal, the sensory thing, its ballast. And so this is where the thing in itself is. Follow so far?
So the noumenon is the thing in itself, and it's what it's what gives the it's what gives the object its meaning, or is it what gives the sensory experience its meaning?
So the thing in itself, the noumenon, would be objects as they are, independent
Okay.
of observation.
Okay.
Okay. So the apple that we're looking at, we perceive this within consciousness.
Yeah.
But the apple by itself that exists because Kant adheres to an independent reality separate from us, that the
Right.
apple existing by itself is the noumenon, apart from
Yeah.
consciousness.
Right. Right.
That's what the thing in itself is.
That's that dualistic and rationalistic mindset.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. But again, this is one of those common sense realism type of things
Yeah.
where with the German idealists, as we see with Hegel and the rest of them, even starting beforehand with Fichte and Jacobi. This
Oh,
is
I've never
before
heard of
Hegel.
those two.
Yeah, they're very well known in German idealism, but you have to delve deep into that. So, the idealist approach is that everything exists within a mind,
Right.
that there's no separate reality, or that everything is just phenomenalistic, as we see in the 20th century, where there is nothing apart from our perceptions.
So sort of the opposite of Kant.
Yes, the opposite of Kant.
Okay.
Now, again, Kant adheres to, yes, there is an independent reality. However, the problem is we're always stuck in the fact is that whatever we're looking at, whatever we're apprehending, is the phenomenon, what appears to us in consciousness and in the mind. Okay?
Yep.
Good so far?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the thing in itself, the noumenon, presented some problems for philosophers, Kant himself. Now, I remember when I was in graduate school, I did a paper on the Kant and the thing of itself. And I was using a book that had come out, what was it, like the mid-90s or so? Henry B. Allison, who is a very well-known American Kant scholar, who had said that the thing in itself actually was a mental construct or conceptual construct that Kant had come up with. Now, this is one way to interpret the thing in itself, is that there is really no such thing as a thing in itself. It's just some kind of a concept that Kant had come up with to explain the problems that are inherent in a phenomenal perception of things.
That makes
And
sense to me.
yet there are others who take the interpretation as that, yes, the thing in itself is something that exists apart from us.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Wouldn't that be? I mean, the first interpretation makes more sense to me. Although, like, you can't necessarily conclusively prove it one way or the other.
No, which is, this is all part of Kant scholarship. Some people believe that the thing in itself, that Kant had said, yes, this is something that actually exists, rather than it's just a conceptual apparatus that he came up with to explain something else.
That's kind of what philosophers do.
Yeah, really. Surprise, surprise.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's get into Maimon. So I'm relying on Wikipedia here because this is very succinct. So one thing that Maimon criticizes is the thing in itself. And I will start off here. So Maimon seizes upon the fundamental incompatibility of a consciousness which can apprehend and yet is separate from the thing in itself. That which is object of thought cannot be outside consciousness. Just as in mathematics, -1 is an unreal quantity. -1 is a negative number or an unreal number. So things in themselves are ex hypothesi, outside consciousness, that is, are unthinkable. Okay, so Maimon is taking the tack as that he probably would accept the interpretation that the thing in itself is just kind of a conceptual construct.
Right.
So continuing, the Kantian paradox, Maimon explains as the result of an attempt to explain the origin of the given in consciousness. The form of things is admittedly subjective.
Wait, what is the given in consciousness in this context?
Oh, okay. So the given is something that you find within epistemology. There is the belief, and there is the something of the given, what is already given to consciousness that exists there, and that is not constructed.
Okay, so it's like an inherent part of consciousness.
Well, it's not an inherent part of consciousness; it's an inherent part of reality.
Okay. Okay.
Something is given to us. Now, later on, when we get into our Rorty series with Hayden, whenever that starts,
Hopefully in a few weeks.
hopefully in a few weeks, Rorty was very much influenced by another philosopher of the 20th century, Wilfrid Sellars, who, in one of his most famous um, criticisms is what he called the myth of the given. There is no such thing as a given out there. It is constructed.
Why does that phrase sound familiar to me? The myth of the given. I don't know where I would have heard that.
Because you find it all the time in epistemology texts or epistemology commentaries. It's the myth of the given.
Okay.
Is there such a thing given to us in consciousness, or given to us as a conscious being, or is this whole given just something that we create from conscious perception?
I'm more inclined to believe that second proposition.
Yeah, mine is somewhere in the middle. I do believe in an objective reality, but it's also constituted.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Although I'm not more than 95% sure of anything. But there being objective reality is something that I'm like 95% sure of.
That's right.
Yeah.
I can take a frying pan, hit you in the face, and say, "Well, I don't think that was constructed."
Yeah.
I think that was real. I got the mark to prove it. All right. So continuing. The Kantian paradox Maimon explains as the result of an attempt to explain the origin of the given in consciousness. Okay, so this is what Kant is trying to do with the noumenon. The form of things is admittedly subjective. The mind endeavors to explain the material of the given in the same terms, an attempt which is not only impossible, but involves a denial of the elementary laws of thought. Knowledge of the given is, therefore, essentially incomplete. Okay, makes sense?
Yeah.
Complete or perfect knowledge is confined to the domain of pure thought, to logic and mathematics. Thus, the problem of the thing in itself is dismissed from the inquiry, and philosophy is limited to the sphere of pure thought. Okay, so if you recall when we were going over Kant, there's the distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori.
Mm-hmm.
So the a priori is what is already present to us in our mind that is complete. Mathematics. 2 + 2 = 4. Doesn't matter what the 2 is. 2 things plus 2 things equals 4. Or the laws of logic. All bachelors are unmarried men. Andrew is a bachelor, therefore Andrew is an unmarried man.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That does not give us any new knowledge. A posteriori knowledge, on the other hand, does, because that's what we derive from sense perception and from sensory inquiry. Okay?
Yep.
With me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So as Maimon was saying, complete or perfect knowledge is confined to the domain of pure thought, to logic and mathematics. Okay. So philosophy deals with pure thought, not necessarily with impure thought or derivative thought. Okay. So that's the thing in itself. Maimon was critical of that. Moving right along, going to the categories. Okay. So I mentioned in the last time that Kant had come up with the categories which very closely maps onto Aristotelian categories. What are the Aristotelian categories? Substance, extension, place, length, all these things. These are the kind of categories that can apply to a sensory object. They fit within these categories. So Kant took the categories and he stuck them into the mind instead of something that exists inherent into the object itself. Okay?
Right.
So Maimon says the Kantian categories are demonstrable and true, but their application to the given is meaningless and unthinkable. By this critical skepticism, Maimon takes up a position intermediate between Kant and Hume. So Hume is the radical skeptic, Hume is the radical empiricist, Kant is the synthesis between rationalism and empiricism. So Hume's attitude to the empirical is entirely supported by Maimon. The causal concept, A causes B, we say there is such a thing, causality, as given by experience, expresses not a necessary objective order of things, but an ordered scheme of perception. It is subjective. It cannot be postulated as a concrete law apart from consciousness. Okay, so this is in essence a reiteration of Hume's skepticism towards causality.
Oh, okay.
We say that there's a
Yeah.
causal relation, but it does not exist in reality. It is something that exists within the mind. When we say
Yeah.
when we say that the billiard ball strikes we say that the cue ball strikes the 8 ball and it sends it into the side pocket. We say that the cue ball caused the 8 ball to go into the side pocket. Doesn't exist in objective reality. We say that. It's a
Yeah.
relation.
And we don't know whether A causes B, or whether C causes A, or whether
Right.
B causes A, or so on and so forth. I remember
Right.
liking that about Hume.
Yeah, so we can directly perceive an A and B, and then we can infer other causes. Well, we think that this might have happened, this would cause this, and then there's a chain of causality. But all this takes place subjectively within consciousness.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. So that's a second criticism. The third criticism, or is one thing that Maimon brings up that is very attractive to Deleuze, is the doctrine of differentials. Okay. So, whereas Kant posed a dualism between understanding and sensibility, or between concepts and the given, Maimon refers both these faculties back to a single source of cognition. Sensibility, in Maimon's view, is therefore not completely without conceptual content, but is generated according to rules that Maimon calls differentials. In calling them this, Maimon is referring to the differentials from the calculus, which are entities that, despite being neither qualitative nor quantitative, can nevertheless give rise to a determinate quantity and quality when related to other differentials. The operations of the faculty of sensibility are, for Maimon, therefore not principally different from those of mathematical intuition. For example, seeing the color red is the same procedure as drawing a geometrical figure such as a line in a circle in thought. The reason that qualities are nevertheless given is that it is only an infinite understanding that could grasp the rules for the generation of qualities in the way that a human understanding can grasp the rules for drawing a circle.
Does that imply that humans have that kind of infinite understanding?
Let me read this again. The reason that qualities are nevertheless given is that it is only an infinite understanding that could grasp the rules for the generation of qualities in the way that a human understanding could grasp the rules for drawing a circle. Okay, so I read into that is, again, this is a criticism of the given. So there is the given, but I guess what this is saying is that one would have to have an infinite understanding, which humans do not. And the infinite understanding is everything that goes into creating that quality in that given. Or to put it another way is whatever we know, whatever we perceive about reality, because there is an existing reality here, that it's only a small part of it. We don't grasp everything at one time.
Yeah, that
We're
makes
just
total
not
sense.
designed that way.
Yeah, it makes total sense. It's
Right.
like basically impossible to know all the relevant factors in every situation.
Right. So this criticism of the given is that, yes, there might be a given, but it's not a given all at the same time. Or whatever qualities that there is of an object in the given, you have to have an inner understanding to the generation of the qualities. Okay.
Right. Okay.
All right. So that's the doctrine of differentials, but we'll see more of that in the essay. And that's it. These are the three things that stick out about Maimon from the Wikipedia article. That'll give us our basis for diving into the essay itself.
All right.
Okay. So let's go to the book. This is chapter 6, starting on page 104. The essay by Graham Jones, who's one of the editors of the book, Solomon Maimon. All right. So we won't go into Maimon's life. We'll give it short shrift. He was born in Poland. He was a Polish-Russian rabbi from a humble, poverty-stricken background.
It's a very interesting life.
Yes, very interesting life. So he was a Jew. He was very well versed in the Talmudic tradition, and he was well acquainted with some Jewish philosophers such as Spinoza. Okay, but he understood Kant well, according to Kant himself. So, as Graham Jones says in the first paragraph, after reading Kant, who claimed to have resolved the dispute between rationalism and empiricism, Maimon set out to write a commentary on Kant's critique of pure reason, which would also outline the general principles of his own philosophy, which he referred to as a coalition system, an ingenious attempt at synthesizing and reconciling the differing and seemingly incompatible positions of Leibniz, Hume, and Kant. This document, called the Essay on Transcendental Philosophy, both mammoth in size and written in idiosyncratic German, because he never learned to speak it correctly, was eventually passed on to the aging Kant, who grudgingly acknowledged that, quote, that none of my opponents had understood me so well, but that very few could claim so much penetration and subtlety of mind in profound inquiries of this sort. That's a high compliment right there.
Yeah, because like you were saying at the beginning, Maimon is obscure and kind of hard to understand.
Well, he's obscure because not very many people read him.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Now, I did some digging and I I came up with a translation of the Essay on Transcendental Philosophy. Maybe one day I'll read it, along with the hundreds of other books I got in my queue.
Okay.
Okay. But continuing. So we go to the section, the Kantian context. Now, Jones continues. Kant's Copernican revolution in his critique of pure reason was to claim that the world, quote, world, conforms to our thoughts rather than the reverse. For something, an object to be determined, it must be thought, as it is cognition which provides objectivity and thus produces objects. So,
Oh, that reminds me of a lecture by A.C. Grayling I was watching earlier, in which he was talking about, I think it was Wittgenstein's theory that objects are, I think the way he phrased it is that objects are constructed by sensory perception, which I thought was strange, because you could say that about objects that were made by humans, and maybe about something like anthills in nature, but not for the overwhelming majority of what happens in nature, because most of most objects that are created in nature are created without any conscious agency whatsoever.
yeah, that's evolution at work.
Yeah,
Yeah. But what we're talking about here is perception of an object.
yeah.
So there
Oh,
are
okay.
there are objects out there, but remember what I had said before about the five senses. So, what comes to mind is that if you're talking about taste, taste is a combination of smell and taste. You don't
Right.
have taste without smell. Okay. Also, and this gets back into Kant too, is that Kant also tried to explain how is it that we can come up with a perception of an object using the five senses. If each of the five senses is distinct, I touch something, I smell something, I see something, and so on, that what binds them all together? Well, this is the transcendental unity of apperception and the synthesis of what goes on within the mind and cognition.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, continuing on. With Kant, he placed synthesis at the center of his account. Just covered that. Inasmuch as for something to be a, quote, object, it must be the result or product of the synthesis of some kind, of a joining or uniting of elements. The notion of synthesis was not unique to Kant's philosophy, however. Indeed, it was commonplace within empiricism. We saw this with Hume, too. Kant's innovation was to place synthesis at a transcendental level, as an a priori, as independent of experience and as the condition of the possibility of experience in general. Okay. So with Hume, the difference there was that Hume talked in terms of association, impressions and ideas. Impressions are what strike upon the senses. Ideas are what form as a result of what strikes upon the senses. But association is this operation of the mind that joins all the ideas together. And that's
Okay.
where we come up with things like the notion of causality.
Right.
Okay. So that's what happens in the mind. But as Jones points out, is that what Kant had contributed to this is that this is transcendental. This is a quality, an inherent quality of the mind.
Oh, that we should clarify for anyone watching who doesn't know that that definition of transcendental, because
Right.
I remember it was confusing for me at first.
Right. So transcendental is opposed to immanent. Okay.
Yeah.
Immanent is what exists here and now. Transcendental is something that is above that.
Yeah.
But transcendental in this context with Kant does not mean like a transcendent God.
Yeah, not like it doesn't have the way it confused me is that I assumed it had a religious definition, but it doesn't.
Right. You could think of it more as a meta level.
Yeah,
This is metacognition, what happens here.
yeah, yeah.
Okay? So continuing on, Jones says, Kant's second innovation was to claim that the thought without a corresponding sensible component, to which it is linked through the unimary of the imagination, is empty and formal. For only sensation denotes something as actual, making of such a synthesis a real occurrence or event in respect to the objects appearing. So, in contradistinction to what the rationalists had said, this does not exist in and of itself, using for more or less. So, something is only actual because of sensation.
Right.
We see it. So, going back to the thing itself thing, there is something out there that we would call an apple, but we perceive it. I mean, think of it this way: is that there's an apple in my kitchen. I know there's an apple there because I have seen it, but I know it because I have seen it. When I go into the kitchen, the apple appears before me as the phenomenon. So
Yeah.
then it becomes actual. Otherwise, you're just doing a mental operation. Well, I think there's an apple that exists somewhere, or I think there are such things as apples.
Right.
Okay, make sense?
Yeah. And
All right.
these like we understand that it's an apple because we have this a priori concept of an apple based on the invention of language to apply to this concept of the apple, right?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. I would
No?
say that the knowledge of an apple is a posteriori, because remember, a priori is something that is true in and of itself and does not give us new knowledge.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. When we were born, we knew implicitly, we're following this thread, we knew implicitly that if I hold up my one hand, if I hold up my other hand, there's two hands I have in front of me. But
Mhm.
I didn't know about an apple until I first saw it.
And we don't know, and we only like when we hold both hands up, we say that that's two because we invented the number two to apply to two hands being held up.
We use the concept of two.
Yeah.
But to express the concept of two, I mean, you have one thing, you have another thing. There's two things. I have one apple, one hand, two things. I have one apple, two hands, two apples, and so on. Okay.
Yeah.
But that's the point of the a priori. It does not give us any new knowledge because it is true in and of itself.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Kant's third innovation, the distinction he draws between phenomena, the objects of experience, and things in themselves. Okay, we've already covered that. So then the fourth innovation, the claim that the efforts of the faculties of sensibility, imagination, and understanding converge upon the empirical object of cognition, such that collectively they identify the object in an act of recognition, and correspondingly that their efforts converge in the opposite direction on a center or locus that coordinates and unifies their efforts, the transcendental unity of apperception or the transcendental subject. So I covered that just briefly, the transcendental unity of apperception, all the five senses converging together, also sensibility, imagination, and understanding. I see this object, it appears to me, my understanding identifies it as an apple.
Right.
Okay. So then the transcendental subject, what is that? That's the I. But the transcendental subject is not something that objectively exists. It is the grammatical subject I points to this transcendental unity of apperception.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Good so far?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then Jones continues. The fifth innovation from Kant was to split thought in two, dividing its powers and concepts between two faculties, understanding and reason. The former, understanding, can produce possible objects of experience, but the latter, reason, is the faculty of pure thought as such and has no direct relationship with sensibility. Its own concepts, the ideas, capital I, pose problems in their most general form. So, these ideas, capital I, would include the soul, God, the totality of the cosmos, things in themselves, freedom, and so forth. They are unconditioned conditions, that is, causes that are themselves seemingly uncaused or self-causing, that we fall back on in order to explain the ultimate nature of things. So,
Wait, those categories make sense to me in terms of what he's talked about so far because he's sort of alluded to or mentioned or directly mentioned those other concepts, but the only one that doesn't sound similar to those ones to me anyway is freedom. So does he get into why he decided that these are those capital I ideas?
Well, think of it this way. So, as Jones had explained, these are the unconditioned conditions. This is a Kantian term. So this is what we use to explain something that is uncaused. For example, how did the universe come into being? Well, there was a creator, God. Okay,
According to Kant?
this is according to typical explanations. This is where the creationist argument comes in.
Right.
Okay, so here's a universe. How did it come into being? Was it caused? Yes, it was caused by a creator being that we call God. Okay, so God is the idea, capital I, that is used to explain the origin of the universe.
Right.
Okay, how does the person have a personality, or what makes a person a person? Well, there is something called the soul. Okay, but what caused the soul? Well, God caused the soul.
God
Okay,
caused
so
everything.
God caused everything. So you see where this chain of reasoning goes.
Yeah.
And if you press somebody to explain, well, who created God? Well, nobody
And
created God. God just emerged. He was always there. Okay.
right.
Now, for something like freedom, well, freedom is not something that you can perceive. It's not a thing. It's a concept. It's an idea that explains that, okay, so how is it that we're able to do X, Y, and Z and we are not determined? Well, it's something that's freedom. We have free will and so forth.
Okay.
Okay.
Free will, we have freedom and free will because God gave it to us. That's the common narrative, I think, right?
Well, maybe, but also that freedom is something that we shoot for. Freedom is a worthwhile goal unto itself. But
Right.
what are the causes of freedom? You can't point to one thing and say this is what causes freedom.
No.
Okay. So, according to Kant, such ideas are ideals or themes, hypothetical or speculatively inferential concepts that empirically we can neither prove nor disprove. Now, for example, has anybody ever seen God? People would claim they have, but there's no consensus on that there is such a thing as God or what does God look like.
Yes.
Okay. Cannot be proven nor disproven. It's a matter of faith. Yet which function is helpful foci in respect to organizing and systematizing the various disparate pieces of knowledge that objective experience provides. They are then necessary means of making sense of or providing a broader unity and arrangement to the, quote, world. However, in this sense, they are not constitutive things or real causes, merely regulative guidelines for further research. Now, Kant continues also with these ideas in saying that these reside within reason. But when reason goes too far, then we run into trouble.
Ah, okay.
Okay. So, for convenience's sake, we could say that people have souls. For convenience's sake, we could say that there is such a thing as God. For convenience's sake, we can say that there is such a thing as freedom, and so on. But how do we prove this? Well, we can't prove these empirically, cannot be proven nor disproven. And if we accept those as objectively true, that yes, there is such a thing as God, objectively so, that's where you run into problems.
Well,
According
yeah.
to reason and using reason to critique reason, what Kant
Well,
does in the first critique.
yeah, because like you said, you can't prove or disprove those capital I ideas.
Right. So these are useful foci, as Jones likes to use the term.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's Kant in a nutshell. Pressing on, we'll go to the section Maimon's critique. Okay. So Jones continues. Maimon directs his initial attentions towards the inadequacies of Kant's transcendental deduction in the Critique of Pure Reason, wherein Kant argued that transcendental, a priori concepts called categories, provided by the faculty of understanding and acting in accordance with transcendental principles, extrinsically condition or subsume sensory impressions provided by the faculty of sensibility. In doing so, the categories determine or provide the continuity, objectivity, and order of such impressions. So in the transcendental
Sorry. What does the faculty of sensibility mean again?
sensory, sense perception.
Okay.
Okay, that's one of the faculties of the mind is sensibility, the
Okay.
fact perception.
Okay.
Okay, so in the transcendental deduction, this is what Kant used to prove the existence of the categories.
Okay.
Okay, but
So
again,
yeah, this is like
remember that transcendental is something like on a meta level.
right.
So
So
we
it's
can't.
like transcendental empiricism kind of, isn't it?
Well, that's Deleuze. This is not Kant.
Okay.
Okay, we'll put that off to the side.
Okay.
So Jones continues. Against this, the transcendental deduction, Maimon argues that there is no convincing evidence that the synthetic a priori principles or concepts proposed by Kant necessarily apply to a posteriori sense perceptions, necessity and universality being the two preconditions that Kant insists ground the objectivity experience and derive from thought. Okay? He insists that Kant is unable to find a justifiable criterion with which to determine when synthetic a priori concepts apply. So, synthetic a priori as what is derived from sense perception, not that already existed there.
Right.
Okay? Synthetic a priori concepts apply. For he has no way of distinguishing those cases in which these concepts do apply in experience from those in which they do not. And as such, all, quote, the evidence of our senses, as Hume argued, shows us only a constant conjunction between distinct events, but never any universal and necessary connections. So, going back to what it said before, Maimon is sympathetic to Hume. He takes his position. So, with causality, A and B, that's a constant conjunction, and this is what we call causality. But that does not mean that this applies universally and that this is a necessary thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay?
That makes sense.
So,
That's an important caveat.
right. So, continuing. From these skeptical beginnings, Maimon extends his critique of Kant's philosophy, focusing on the insufficiency of Kant's dualism. He questions how the two fundamentally distinct, heterogeneous faculties of sensibility and understanding, one passive and receptive, and the other active and spontaneous, can genuinely interact. And then Maimon's solution is to reject the dualism of the transcendental deduction. So, let's do away with such a thing as sensibility and understanding. Let's just get rid of it.
Okay.
Okay? Jones continues. Rather than a centralized intellect, as the empiricists proposed, such as Hume, for Maimon asks, how can something intelligible be made from the unintelligible? He instead embraces the more satisfactory Leibnizian alternative of intellectualizing the senses. That is, by assuming that the understanding is the source of both the form and the content of experience, and that sensibility is not itself a separate source of knowledge, but rather a confused form of thought.
That's interesting.
Okay, so he rejects sensibility and understanding. We're not gonna say that there is something like sense perception, and the mind imposes the categories upon that sensory perception, giving it to us. We'll just get rid of that. But to avoid the problem that you get with empiricism, which is if you're doing away with reason and everything is just sense perception, how can something arise from that? It's a jumbled mass.
Yeah.
And then Leibnizian, going back to Leibniz himself, is intellectualizing the senses. So the understanding is the source of everything.
I remember in what you sent me to read about Maimon, thinking that when he was going into intellectualizing the senses and saying that like basically the mind intellectualizes sort of his version of the highest good. I remember it sounding like almost like a theological argument for rationalism, because he talks about how intellectualism is the most direct way to know God or something like that.
Right. So you could say, in effect, that Maimon is a rationalist.
Yeah.
So he is moving away from Kant's empiricism, because Kant was an empiricist,
Mm-hmm.
and instead going back to the rationalists,
Right.
particularly with Leibniz. Okay. So with the understanding, the form and content of experience, and that sensibility is a confused form of thought.
Right.
Okay. In this fashion, Maimon turns the qualitative difference between sensibility and understanding into a quantitative one, such that they differ only in degree, where a decrease in the former can be said to reflect a proportional increase in the latter. Thus, the indistinctness, confusion, and obscurity that characterizes the intuition, sensory intuition, gives way to the clarity and distinctness of the concept. For the more we truly know, the less we are affected. So, Maimon is downplaying the senses.
Right.
He is elevating um, the understanding.
Right.
Okay. But as Jones continues, he says Maimon's solution to Kant's dilemma, therefore, raises potential difficulties of its own concerning the nature of our perceptions and how we experience them. Okay, fair point. So if you're downplaying the senses, then what do we do with them? Well, this is where the next section comes in. Page 108, Infinitesmals and Differentials. Okay. Jones continues. He says, Maimon similarly regards the matter of sensation, the manifold content of a perception, as consisting of such extensionless degrees, of gradations or constitutive differential elements. Moreover, he argues that these lie below the threshold of conscious recognition. They are unconscious elements, imperceptible in themselves. Okay?
Okay.
So, manifold content of perception, that's a Kantian term. What is presented to us within sensation is a manifold, many different things. Sight, touch, smell,
Okay.
gradations, how it looks in the light, and so on. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. But with the differential, whenever we hit, we've gone through enough essays now where wherever you see differential, this is what really attracts Deleuze.
Yeah.
Why he was attracted to Maimon. Because Kant was the enemy, Maimon is a fellow traveler, because he was critical of Kant
Right.
in this
Okay.
respect.
Okay.
Okay. So Jones continues. Maimon relates these imperceptible elements to Leibniz's differential and integral calculus. The infinitesimals, the really small differences in degrees, infinitely subdivided into smaller units where they just seem to vanish, they become indiscernible, without ever reaching zero. Such as, what an asymptote is? You're getting closer and closer and closer and closer, but you never quite get there.
Oh, okay. No, I've
That's
never
what.
heard that before.
Yeah. So whenever you hear the word asymptote, which is something you hear in trigonometry and calculus, it's a curve it's a line tangent to a curve, but the curve will never touch the line. It gets closer and closer and closer. Think of what I was saying before about the definition of a point. You draw a line and you put a point on it. Well, the point you've already given some form and you've given some definition to. But the concept of a point itself has no definition. It's just a concept.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, remember that?
Yeah.
Okay.
How does that work in geometry with that curved line that never quite touches it? Like, how is that? I don't understand how that could be possible.
Well, it's possible kind of on a conceptual level.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Remember, when we're dealing with something like geometry, okay, this is something that really struck me when I first studied it in high school, is that when you say there's a line, a point, a triangle, a square, a circle, and so on, all of these, fundamentally, these are conceptual definitions. What a circle looks like, what a square looks like when you draw it, whatever it is, or what materials you make, will differ greatly.
Yeah.
Now, some would say that with the triangle and the square and all that, there is such a thing as a platonic idea of
Right.
such a thing that exists.
The Platonic ideal of the
The
square.
platonic ideas, that's right. Or you can work with Kant and say these already exist in the mind. Well. Now we see in a small way why Kant is the enemy. Because you remember from the very first essay we covered is that Deleuze, what is he trying to do, as other philosophers have done before him? he is trying to overturn Platonism.
Yes.
Okay.
Because Plato is the enemy too.
Plato is the enemy. It's because he relies far too much on the transcendental and not on the immanent.
Yeah.
Puts the ideas up in another worldly realm and completely is, well, maybe not completely, but definitely downgrading experience. This is, what did Whitehead said? All of philosophy is but a footnote to Plato.
Yeah.
We've 2,000 not some years later, we're still wrestling with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And like
So,
it's similar to, it sounds like what, in terms of what Maimon says about differentials, that Deleuze prefers his idea of the plane of immanence too.
right, right. And the differential, fundamentally, what it is that it's a difference of degree. When,
Right.
particularly with identity, we've already covered this. Identity, your identity is distinct from my identity, is more a difference of degree than it is you have a separate identity from mine.
Right.
And
Yeah.
they're incontestable. They are, they formed, but they're unchangeable
Yeah.
type of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving right along, next page, Joan says, Maimon takes up Leibniz's terminology, referring to the divisible, dimensionless elements of intensive magnitude as infinitesimals. More importantly, though, he views their interrelations in terms of a differential relation in which, although no longer perceivable by the senses, they are still determinable by the understanding, even if beneath the threshold of consciousness, in a matter akin to the way that the differential equation defines the properties of a curve through its analysis in terms of an infinite division of points. And that's really, according to calculus, what a curve is. It's an infinite succession of points. In such a manner, Maimon extends Leibniz's mathematical account into a direct metaphysical claim, okay, concerning the nature of infinitesimals and differentials, thus arguably making explicit what was perhaps already implicit in Leibniz's thinking.
Okay.
Okay, so the differential is matters of degree. The infinitesimal is it goes on potentially infinite, what the degree is.
Right.
Okay, that's really it in a nutshell. So Maimon is a Leibnizian.
So if
He is
if those differences go on infinitesimally, doesn't that kind of, like you were just saying, eventually sort of make it get to the point where those differences kind of vanish?
yeah, that's what the point is.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's in the term itself, the infinitesimal. If something is infinite, it goes on and on and on and on.
Right.
Potentially, they vanish.
Right.
Okay, so we could refer back to an example: is that the difference between you and I? The differential exists right there. What is the difference between you and I? Well, we can enumerate a list of different things, but these are conceptual. If we say, I have no hair because I I shave my head and I'm bald, and you have a full head of hair, there's a difference there. But by how
Hmm.
much? If I let my hair grow in, I'm not completely bald. I still have some hair.
And I often give myself a buzz cut every few months or so, so then I'm very close to bald
Right.
sometimes.
You're very close to bald.
Yeah.
And if you say, well, there's, you can go down to the genetic level, you can go down to the subatomic level. That's true. But, in contemporary physics, what is an atom? What is a subatomic particle? Has anybody ever seen it? It's kind
Yeah.
of a conception. What exists underneath the subatomic particles? Well, that's the domain of quantum mechanics, which we're not going to get into here.
Higgs boson particle.
It's a boson particle. Heisenberg's principle of undeterminacy, man.
Yeah.
You never know what's going to happen.
Nope. Could be anything.
Could be anything. That's right.
Until
Okay.
you open up that box, Schrodinger's cat could be dead or alive.
It could, yes. Very good reference. So, Jones continues. In respect to the unconscious and imperceptible nature of these differential elements, Maimon also links them to Leibniz's theory of petite perceptions, little perceptions. So I'll go into this here. Well, first of all, let me say that the again, Maimon was saying is that the sensibility, or I think one way is a really Really taking it seriously is just a confused form of thought. Everything resides within the understanding.
Right.
And we know in the understanding is that there is the infinitesimals and the differentials.
Right.
Okay. So with these petite perceptions, Jones says, Leibniz had argued that mental activity was a continuous activity, much of what went on below the threshold of consciousness. That is, he suggested that in some sense we are still thinking when quiescent, calm, asleep, or even comatose. That's an important point right there. And in line with his belief that sensory perceptions were in fact confused or unclear forms of mental activity on the part of monads, he subsequently suggested that our conscious perceptions, although seemingly homogeneous, were in fact built up from numerous little impressions. So monad is a concept unique to Leibniz. It is a self-contained entity.
Okay.
Okay, I'm
So
not going to get
what would be an example?
of a monad. That's a good question. I can't think of one. But just accept it as a self-contained entity. I don't want to
Okay.
get too far into that. Okay.
Okay.
So we're built up from little impressions or micro-perceptions of which we were not conscious. Whilst at some level we still remain aware of or sense all of these separate micro-perceptions, no matter their number, their singularity or the distinctness of their respective individual contributions lies beneath the threshold of conscious recognition, making imperceptibles of them, at least at the global or molar level. In this respect, for Maimon, sensations as intensive magnitudes similarly consist of infinitesimal degrees of subliminal mental activity. They are merely the products of the subconscious workings and laws of the understanding, sensations appearing, given in contingent, and as confused representations, only because their actual production lies beneath or beyond the threshold of individual consciousness. Now, this here is important because I think you find a lot of this in contemporary cognitive science, where perception is not just one thing. Perception is a collection of different operations. And even there's a lot that's going on beneath the surface we're not even aware of.
Yes.
Okay. So I would say that both Leibniz and Maimon were kind of prescient in this respect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
But, going back to the petite perceptions or the little impressions, is that this is what perception is made of. It's not just one thing, it's a whole lot of little things that coalesce together,
Yeah, for sure.
going on beneath consciousness. We can perceive something. I mean, this is going into the thing about consciousness, is that we might be aware of something, but we're not conscious of it. Or, like Leibniz has said, is that when we're asleep, we're still perceiving.
Yeah.
We're just
Yeah.
unconscious of it. Okay. So Jones continues, because they are productive in their relations, Maimon claims that infinitesimals or differentials are a priori elements of intuition and thus, quote, the necessary condition of the unity of the manifold that makes up conscious perception, in contrast to the given of experience, which is the product of their synthesis.
So how are differentials a priori?
They exist before perception.
Okay.
Okay,
That's his assertion.
right. So
Okay.
the way to explain it is that we are aware of, this is Maimon talking, we are aware of these differentials. We can point out the differentials because if we look at, let's go back to the apple. We look at the apple. So we see the apple and we call it an apple. And what is the apple? It could be a Granny Smith, it could be a Red Delicious or something like that. Those qualities. But when you really get down to brass tacks, no one apple is the same.
No.
Why is that? Because of differentials. There's two red delicious apples, but they're both different because of very subtle qualities that we might not see right away. That's the differential. And the infinitesimal is that it could go on potentially infinitely, what the differences are. But we know this. When we look at the apples, we say, well, that one doesn't look like the other one necessarily. We might think it is at first glance, but when we look very closely, we say that's not the same apple, even
Yeah.
though both of them are red delicious apples.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the point about the infinitesimals of the differentials. They're a priori. They already exist within intuition and in our understanding.
Okay.
And the point about the given of experience is that we are not relying on what is already present to us in our senses. That's the given.
Okay.
So one way to explain this, as I've already said before, is that the understanding is prior to, not a priori, not any of this, but the understanding is prior to sensory perception. Sensation is just confused. It's just confused thought.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the intellectualized way of looking at it that Maimon likes, right?
Right. It's
Right.
intellectualizing the senses, which he
Right.
goes back to Leibniz for that.
Right.
Okay. So something about the given, Jones says. The given is merely a mark of the limitation of our faculty of thought, something not yet thought through or overcome within thought itself. Whereas, in contrast, the infinitesimals and differentials are the building blocks and chain-like laws of thought itself that we must discover, that is, think by way of understanding. As such, empirical objects are thought by way of a priori rules or laws that govern the creation of those same objects, and the quote essence of thought thus consists in thinking of an object, not as already existing, but as resulting from a process of creation or genesis, that is, as becoming. Okay, becoming is another word we see related with Deleuze. It is not, it's there. It is created, it comes into being, it is created, it is becoming.
Yes.
Okay, so Maimon didn't completely reject Kant, but he said that Kant's problem was placing too much on the given.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense in terms of the idea of becoming. And that idea makes a lot of sense too, because things aren't just created instantly. They're created through a process, like you were saying.
Right. So Jones continues, in such a fashion, then, Maimon is able to solve Kant's difficulty in respect of determining the necessary applicability of the categories to intuitions, sensory intuitions, by claiming that the relations are internal to thought itself, and that the sensory aspect of intuition merely involves those elements of thought not yet sufficiently cognized, not yet dissolved into the pure thought that this concept as lawfulness. So, in other words, the relations of things are in thought, not in the thing itself.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, good so far?
Yep.
All right. Now, moving along to Maimon's critique of the thing itself. So, we saw, reading it from Wikipedia, is that Maimon rejects this because the thing in itself doesn't make sense. It doesn't exist objectively.
Right.
Okay. Let's see. So, Jones continues on the next page. Maimon argues that such noumena, thing in itself, are synonymous with the differentials of thought, although they are in fact ideas, capital I, of understanding rather than reason. Ideas meaning like God, the soul, makeup of the cosmos, freedom, and so on. And objects are their corresponding products or phenomena. Okay, so I take this to mean is that Maimon is saying that the noumena or the thing in itself is something that exists within the mind.
Okay.
And we say that there is such a thing as the thing in itself because that's an activity of the mind
Okay.
to give form to the sensory perception, the phenomena.
Yeah, that makes sense. Our minds automatically do that.
Right. And Maimon takes it a step further by saying that the infinitesimals are there in the noumena,
Okay.
the differentials of thought. Differentials of thought.
Okay.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
next page. Okay. Space and time. So we saw in the last episode that space and time is very important for Kant because these are what probably more than anything else are the prime categories that are applied to objects. Whenever we perceive an object, it exists in a space and exists in a time.
Yes.
Okay.
That reminds me of part of that aspect of becoming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So Jones says, turning now to space and time, we see, given that Maimon agrees that intensive magnitude concerns only the matter of intuition, that he must supplement his theory of differentials as noumena with a corresponding account of the a priori forms of space and time in respect of his revised account of the workings of the understanding. Kant said that space and time are a priori. We do not perceive them. We do not come to them by perception or after the fact, because they are already there. How we perceive these objects.
Right.
His account, Maimon's account, seeks a middle ground between Kant and Leibniz. He agrees with Kant that time and space are a priori forms of consciousness, but not that they are a priori forms of intuition. They are merely forms of the understanding, represented in a confused manner. That is to say, space and time are, as Leibniz argued originally, solely conceptual in nature, in the way that we represent them to ourselves, and, quote, they are necessary conditions not of sensation, but of the objectivity and objectality of experience. They are differential concepts that are the minimal conceptual conditions for the thinking of diverse objects. Okay.
What's the difference between objectivity and objectality?
Objectivity, that it exists in the actual world, and objectality, that it is an object.
Okay.
Okay. An object of sensation, of the understanding, or whatever it is.
Okay.
Okay. So the point here is that space and time are not of sensation, but they are of the understanding.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're the conditions for saying that something exists objectively and that something is an object.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So next section, same page, immanence. Jones continues. Maimon claims that the systematic unity of reason and knowledge must be grounded in a matter that can account for things as they are, their real conditions, rather than in their mere possibility, as Kant sought to do. He argues that a critical philosophy that seeks such a transcendental ground will require a new logic, one that reflects its own concerns and which is derived from a single principle. For although the differentials in the form of the ideas of understanding are the rules for the production of objects, they need nonetheless to be unified within an a priori principle of determinability. Jones continues. Maimon argues that formal logic, with its categorical reliance on the Aristotelian principle of non-contradiction, and this is what Kant was doing too, does not have anything of value to say about the application of judgments in a real material world, referring only to that which is formally true of all possible worlds. The role of this principle is then, according to Maimon, to deduce the real categories and to assess the validity of synthetic a priori claims to knowledge in respect of the world as it exists, to provide the criterion by which we can, on the one hand, ascertain objective knowledge of reality as distinct from merely subjective or habitual perceptions, and on the other, distinguish real thought or necessary connection as distinct from formal or arbitrary thought.
Okay.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. So Kant, with logic and the categories, because I said earlier, is that the Kantian categories map very closely to the Aristotelian categories. Kant also was an adherent of Aristotelian logic. There wasn't modal logic really back then, although there was in the medieval period. But Kant stuck very close to Aristotelian logic. So Maimon is arguing is that formal logic doesn't help us.
Okay.
Why? It's because it's like the a priori concept. 2 + 2 = 4. Right? Doesn't tell us anything new. Kant said, Kant with the a priori doesn't give us any new knowledge. Leibniz said the same thing. These analytic truths do not give us any new knowledge. Maimon is continuing this.
Right.
So then, what is this principle he's looking for in the new critical philosophy? Particularly if you're going to go the transcendental route. Should be a single principle and the real categories, the validity of synthetic a priori claims, which comes to the senses, respect to the world as it exists. So what is the criterion by which we can ascertain objective knowledge as reality, as distinct from subjective or habitual perceptions? Let's take a look at the Hume's critique of causality. Causality is just habitual perceptions. We say that A causes B, it's an association, it doesn't exist actual in the world. Where my mind is trying to say, okay, well, what is it about causality? How can we deduce causality? Is it some kind of, Is it an objective principle? Is it something within the understanding? And so on and so forth. And real thought or necessary connection for distinct from formal or arbitrary thought. So instead of coming up with a list of categories that we impose upon our experience, what are the real principles within thought?
Okay.
Okay. Deducing how does thought operate?
Right.
All
Yeah,
right.
that sounds like more of a transcendental view on thought.
Well, it's getting to the, what is, we say what thought of the understanding is, so what are the characteristics of it?
Yeah.
And doing it in such a way that it comes from within it rather than imposing it on from without.
Right.
Okay.
Like try to analyze it separately, sort of, right?
Right. Okay. So Jones continues. Maimon's principle of determinability provides some insight into the way he believes judgments concerning objects are determined. He says, the principle demands that the terms of a proposition concerning something or a state of affairs must, somewhat akin to Leibniz's account of conceptual containment or in esse principle, meaning existing within, exist in an asymmetrical or non-reciprocal relation of dependence, unlike the reciprocal relations of the differentials themselves. That is, in respect of two terms or elements, one must be sufficiently independent of the other such that it is conceivable without it. For example, in the proposition x is y, x must be dependent of y, and therefore conceivable without y, whereas y must be within or entail x in such a way that it is inconceivable without it.
Okay.
Okay, makes sense there?
No, I'm a little confused. Could you repeat that?
Okay, so let's go over this again. Principle of determinability. The principle demands that the terms of a proposition concerning something or a state of affairs must, somewhat akin to Leibniz's account of conceptual containment or in esse principle, exist in an asymmetrical or non-reciprocal relation of dependence, unlike the reciprocal relations of the differentials themselves. Okay, so Maimon talked about the differentials. The differentials, there is a reciprocal relation to there. The one contains the other contains the one, and so on. That's dependence, reciprocal relations. There is a dependence there. So that is, in respect of two terms or elements, one must be sufficiently independent of the other such that it is conceivable without it. For example, in the proposition x is y, x, the first term, must be independent of y and therefore conceivable without y, whereas y must be within or entail x in such a way that it is conceivable without it. So in a proposition, Andrew is a human being. Andrew is the x. Y is the human being. Andrew is a human being. Okay. So is Andrew independent of y? Yes, because we could describe Andrew in different respects. Andrew is a human being. Yes. Andrew is a man. Yes. Andrew is a young man. Yes. Andrew is a Canadian. Yes. Okay. So Andrew is independent of whatever the predicate is.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, so the subject is independent of the predicate.
Right. That's one way of looking at it. But
Okay.
why the predicate must be within or entail X in such a way that it is inconceivable without it. So Andrew is a human being. Human being is dependent upon Andrew. Andrew is a Canadian. Canadian is dependent upon Andrew.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Now that's not to say that that's how we're explaining this this statement, X is Y, but it's trying to illustrate that X, the first term, is independent of the second term, and the second
Right.
term is dependent on the first term.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
So, in essence, the principle of determinability is Maimon's attempt to deduce the transcendental categorical necessity that he argued Kant was unable to provide in his own account. It is the principle that underlies intrinsic conditioning, and which explains how all the elements of experience and knowledge can derive from an internal transcendental logic or foundation. Continuing, The second and more significant notion of immanence that Maimon introduces, and which traverses all of his work, embraces a modified version of a Leibniz's notion of a God who is able to perceive and apperceive the universe in its totality, wedded to a Spinozian monistic notion of a God indistinguishable from nature, that is, the entirety of nature, and as a single self-causing substance. This
Okay.
infinite mind, or infinite understanding, as Maimon usually refers to it, serves to ground the relation of intuitions and concepts, of noumena and phenomena, in an ontological notion of the infinite. It replaces Leibniz's account of an infinite number of irreducible monads with an infinite continuum of which we are all but parts, partitions or sections. As such, the notion of infinite mind is a totality both immanent to, as subconscious cause, and imperceptibly transcendent of finite understanding. It is the unconditioned condition of the world of experience, and thus a Kantian idea which spurs us on toward greater understanding, but which by its very nature remains forever beyond our reach. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So
My
Maimon,
only question with that part is, what does he mean by an unconditioned condition?
well, remember what we had seen with the Kantian ideas. Okay. So we say that the universe came into being because God created it. Okay.
Hmm.
But we can either prove or disprove God.
Right.
It's an idea in the capital I sense. We use it as a convenient bookmark, we could say, to explain this.
Hmm.
Or we say that a person has the personality because they have an incorruptible and immaterial soul. Okay. Again, can't be proven or disproven. You certainly
Right.
can't see God. You certainly can't see the soul, and so on.
Right. Yeah.
So the unconditioned condition is that you have a condition of an explanation, but it itself is unconditioned.
Oh, okay.
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 So with this paragraph, what Jones is doing is describing that Maimon, in essence, he's a Spinozist
Right.
because God is indistinguishable from nature, and he's a monist. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
one being instead of separate. Versus Leibniz with the monads are analogous to like atoms. Okay, except they're self-contained. So Leibniz has said that the world is composed of many infinite monads, which themselves are distinct. Like an atomic theory, in other words.
Okay.
Although the monads had some characteristics that distinguish it from your humble everyday atom. Infinite number of irreducible monads. That's what the building blocks are. So instead, Maimon taking the Spinozist view is that it's a monistic approach, an infinite mind that is the condition under which greater understanding can be had of the
Okay.
world of experience. Okay?
Okay.
So Jones continues, in contrast, what defines finite understanding is its incomplete conscious knowledge, that is, experience. So the way I read this is, with the unconditioned condition of the world of experience, we're subconsciously aware of this. But with finite understanding, we're limited to what our experience tells us.
Hmm.
Okay. And it is finite. So sensibility, sense perception, is finite. But the understanding is potentially infinite.
Yeah.
Okay.
That
Questions so
makes
far?
sense. No, that makes sense.
Okay. So that is our summary of Maimon. Now, turning the page to 115, we'll get to what Deleuze has to say about Maimon.
Right.
So, as I said before, for Deleuze, Kant is the enemy.
Hmm.
Maimon is a fellow traveler because he was a critic of Kant.
Right.
All right. So, page 115. This is a quote here that Jones gives. I'll go ahead and read it in full. From Difference and Repetition, Deleuze says, quote, about the duality. Such a duality refers us back to the extrinsic criterion of constructibility and the renunciation of any genetic requirement. For difference remains external and as such empirical and impure, suspended outside the construction between the determinable intuition and the determinate concept. Maimon's genius lies in showing how inadequate the point of view of conditioning is for a transcendental philosophy. Both terms of the difference must equally be thought. In other words, determinability must itself be conceived as pointing toward a reciprocal determination. So in other words, I think what Deleuze is saying here, the duality is sensibility and understanding, what Kant came up with.
Okay.
So any genetic requirement, where does it originate? The difference remains external and such empirical and impure. Okay. So any kind of transcendental philosophy in conditioning, but you have to think of the difference between the two equally.
Right.
Reciprocal determination of the both. That is, how does sensibility influence understanding, and how does understanding influence sensibility?
Right.
Okay. Moving right along, the idea. This is the Kantian idea. Okay. So Jones says, for Kant, the ideas of the faculty of reason, for example, God, the soul, the universe, and so on, have three characteristics. Their speculative and problematic nature, their concern with pure thought and unconditioned conditions, and their synthesizing function. It is these very same aspects of the idea that Deleuze takes up, drawing out their implications and transforming them in the process. First of all, Deleuze claims that although ideas concern problems, perplexing underlying conditions, this does not suggest a lack, insufficiency, or absolute determinacy on their part. That they are not determinable in experience does not mean that they are not determinable as such. Okay, so for example, the concept of God, or the idea of God, we deploy it to explain a lack. How did the universe come into being? Well, God created it. Okay. So we use this, they are indeterminate. But that doesn't mean that we could not formulate the idea of God in such a way to explain the lack of how do you explain the universe.
Right.
Okay. So we could create the concept of God. I think we do this all the time. And when you really get into like philosophy of religion, is that what are the predicates that one applies to God? How does one describe God? Where do you locate God, and so forth? So we already are describing that. It's not that, oh, everybody knows what God is. We just put it in place to explain something.
Yeah. And there isn't like, there sure as hell is not like one definition of God that everyone believes in. There's so many more. And like you were saying, when you get into the philosophy of religion in particular, you discover that there are like innumerable ways to describe the idea of God.
Sure. And you take the Spinoza's tack is that God is synonymous with nature.
Right.
Which is what Maimon is doing too.
That seems like that seems sort of like Shane Kennedy's definition of God.
But he said that before?
He said the way he describes it, it sounds like that, but it kind of sounds more specifically like what he's describing is evolution when he talks about his definition.
Okay. Well, yeah. It should be interesting when we get to Pomo Theo.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the first claim. The second, Deleuze points out that if thought, by way of the understanding, produces objects, then so too must reason, as the faculty of pure thought. That is, the idea must also have an object of some sort.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's what we were talking about earlier in terms of how whether sensory perception can construct objects.
Right. So the understanding is what gives form to sensibility, but reason is what exists transcendentally. Okay. But Kant, in his descriptions, is that reason is pretty well set. You the whole point of the critique of pure reason is using reason to explain reason, its operations.
Mm-hmm.
And something like the categories, this is already taken as a given, not the sensory given, but it's already given. These are the categories that are imposed.
Still there, Tim?
I'm still here. Yep.
Yeah, you got cut off for a minute there.
Yeah. Okay. Did you get my last one about thought?
No.
Okay. Well, let me go ahead and read it again. Deleuze points out that thought by way of the understanding produces objects, then so too must reason, as the faculty of pure thought. That is, the idea must also have an object of some sort. So what I had said before cut off is that when you look at the categories, reason could have created those categories.
Right. Okay.
As an object.
Right. Yeah.
Reason is contemplating the categories itself. All right. And okay, that's that. Next page. So Jones continues. The idea, Kantian idea, as such is an ideal and genetic structure, real and yet non-empirical, that constitutes a, quote, system of multiple non-localizable connections between differential elements, which is incarnated in real relations and actual terms. That's a mouthful. It provides the ensemble of conditions that determine experience, and thus the potential production of an interrelation of all empirical objects. Unlike its Kantian precursor, then, the idea as virtual multiplicity is fully constitutive, ontological, and immanent.
Ah, there you go.
This is the Deleuzian idea. We've seen some shades of this before in the previous essays.
Immanence. Yeah, for
Right,
sure.
immanence. So the idea is not one thing. This is what Jones is translating Deleuze as, is the ensemble of conditions that determine experience, okay? And thus the potential production of and interrelation of all empirical objects, okay? Multiplicity, another important Deleuzian term.
Yeah.
Okay, good so far?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
continuing determinability, next section. The idea as differential or determinate encompasses or synthesizes all of the elements so far discussed. The idea as problem, virtual multiplicity, and ideal structure, thus clarifying their interrelations. This differential idea consists of three elements. The first one is determinability, in respect to the undetermined. Number two, reciprocal determination, in respect to the determinable. And number three, complete determination, in respect to the determined. Collectively, these moments constitute a process of progressive determination or differentiation that Deleuze claims will provide the immanent and genetic conditions that determine the production of actual or empirical objects. Okay, so a bit of a recap here is that what Deleuze liked about Maimon is, again, criticizing Kant. So Maimon with the differential, is residing within the understanding. And then Deleuze taking that and applying it to the Kantian idea. Okay. We kind of saw this before with the Platonic idea. Okay. The idea is not something fixed and self contained, rather, it's a multiplicity, grounds something else.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is nothing brand spanking new. It's just a support of what Deleuze had started off with Plato. Is that, yes, we can take the idea, the capital I idea, but it's not something fixed. It's rather that multiplicity that it exists, it's real, but it's non-determined. It's not empirical either. Ontological, that it exists as a being, and then it's immanent, it's not transcendental.
Right.
Okay? You could say, in some respects, the grounds of the conditions of experience, or the grounds of conditions of determinability. What determines actual or empirical objects? That's what the idea is.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
So next page. The differences. These differences, subsisting and interpenetrating within the virtual multiplicity, have no identity as such. They constitute but a single intensive continuum of heterogeneous elements, prior to all quality and quantity, space, or extension. As they are without identities, these differential elements cannot be said to be essences. They are inessential. This is why Deleuze insists that the development of the idea is built up from the inessential and the determinable from the indeterminate, providing an answer of sorts to Maimon's question: how can the intelligible be made from the unintelligible? Okay, so in other words, I guess you could say, what's a good way to explain this? So think of grains of sand. I'm trying to come up with an analogy here. You think of undifferentiated sand. You see it on the beach, you see it in a container, you stick your hand in it, you pull it up, and it just trickles out of your hand. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
The grains of sand are the differentials, and they exist, as Jones says, in an intensive continuum of heterogeneous elements. Okay, so each grain of sand is not the same. But the grains of sand, when they coalesce, provide objects. You could take sand and you could form it into an apple. You could take sand and you could form it into a chair. You could take sand and you could form it into a basketball or things like that. But the grains of sand have no essences themselves. Is that a helpful analogy?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So, again, what Deleuze is taking from Maimon is about the differential. All about
Okay.
differentials, infinitesmals, the whole thing. Okay. That's the distinction that Maimon was making between himself and Kant.
Okay.
All right. So continuing, next page, Jones says, Deleuze is adamant that we must substitute everywhere the notion of differential relation for one of distinctive opposition or contradiction if we are to enable determination to relinquish or escape any negative conception. Okay, we had seen this before. So if we're talking about you and I, Andrew, Tim, we can say Andrew is Tim. Is that the case? No. Andrew is not Tim. Tim is not Andrew. There's negative here, the negative conception. And there's an opposition. I'm not you, you are not me. Even though we do share some characteristics. We're both male, human beings, North Americans, and so on.
Right.
But to avoid any kind of negative conception, this is where the differential relation comes in. Instead of saying Andrew is not Tim, we'd say Andrew could be Tim depending on how far we go down this path, because
Right.
there's the differential there instead of a fixed identity between the two of us, in which case we would say Andrew identity is not the same as Tim identity and vice versa.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Relinquish or escape any negative conception, as Jones says.
Okay.
All right. So he continues. These differentials between virtual or inessential elements constitute the variables that designate or assign corresponding values. Reciprocal relations and distributions of those values and relations, in which demarcate a transcendental topological field from which physical or material relations are subsequently derived, in the form of qualities, extension, species, and parts. But it is the reciprocal relations that provide the determinant laws for the development of such differentials of thought, as the source of both intuitions and concepts. It is here that Maimon's ambition of overcoming the insufficiency of extrinsic conditioning is perhaps finally fulfilled, that we must determine both intuition and concept together in a relation internal to thought, and that this is achieved through reciprocal determination within the non-empirical synthesis of the virtual differential idea. Okay, so how I read this is, With Kant, the intuition is what emerges from sensibility, sensory perception. So if I perceive this apple, the apple within consciousness, my conscious mind is the intuition. The content is what applies to it, saying that this is the apple.
Okay.
Okay, that's in Kant. So this relation between the two is internal to thought. This does not exist extrinsically out there, separate from thought. And with the differential idea, which is, if you use the sand analogy, is how you mix them together is where you get form, where you get shape, depth. The qualities too is that the redness of an apple is not something that exists inherently within it, but rather is something that emerges from something else by differential.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is kind of a difficult. It's kind of a difficult way to explain it.
Yeah.
When I read it and I think about it, it does make sense to me. But explaining it to somebody else, you can get tongue tied because you know.
It's very complex.
Well, it's very complex, and also we are so used to thinking in terms of essences and thinking in terms of there's a distinct difference between something,
Yeah.
rather than there is a differential between something
Yeah.
or a difference of degree. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Exactly.
Think of a silly example like Coke and Pepsi. Oh, you know, Coke is vastly different than Pepsi. No, it's not.
Yeah. They're really the same. People just prefer the slight differences.
Yeah. Now maybe like if you're over in Europe, like I was for 2 weeks, there's a slight difference in the taste between Coke that's in Europe and Coke that's in North America.
That would make sense.
It
Yeah.
would make sense. Why is that? Nobody knows, because Coke jealously guards their formula.
Right.
Maybe it's the water, maybe it's the way it's processed or whatever it is, but that there's a distinction there. So, but to call it is that European Coke is vastly different from North American Coke, that's really taking it out on the limb right there.
Yeah.
It's more of a differential. Coke is Coke. There might be a slight difference. Slight
Yeah.
difference. And notice I use use the term difference instead of identity.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
All right. So moving right along. Next page. Jones continues. Deleuze insists that the idea, as differential, in consisting of all its inessential elements and their differential relations, is complete, and thus must be distinguished from the actual object produced from that structure. The problematic object as an ideal, virtual structure is already complete, fully determinate and real. But this is not the same as saying that it exists, that it is actual or empirical. Deleuze's key insight is that the virtual is fully determinate. However, the object is not whole or entire if by this we mean that it has existence. It is not explicated. It is without extensity or quality. Thus, Deleuze insists that such a virtual synthesis can be completely determined in structural terms.
Okay. That's so detailed. I got a little bit lost. How does he get to that conclusion?
Generates a corresponding integration, which then forms the empirical object.
Oh,
Note the
you
virtue.
got cut off for like 20 seconds there.
Oh, okay. So I'll just go back to the beginning. Deleuze's key insight is that the virtual is fully determinate. However, the object is not whole or entire if by this we mean that it has existence. It is not explicated. It is without extensity or quality. Thus, Deleuze insists that such a virtual synthesis can be completely determined in structural terms. Quote, without, for all that, possessing the integrity which alone constitutes its actual existence. That the structure virtually subsists rather than exists marks no deficiency or imperfection in the idea itself. In effect, the differential synthesis of the idea as structure generates a corresponding integration, which then forms the empirical object. But the virtual structure itself bears no resemblance to what it produces. The idea is not a possible entity simply awaiting realization, like a Platonic form, but a principle of transformation. Okay, let that sit a minute.
Okay.
Okay. So notice he uses the term, or the term used here is a structure. Okay. So the structure produces the object. The structure is not the same as the empirical object. And the structure itself is virtual. It's not actual. But it is no less real.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes like it's real to our minds. It feels feels just as real to us.
Right. And
Okay.
remember what we're talking about here in terms of becoming. Okay, the structure, the idea is the collection, we could say, of the differentials, differential relations. And so the idea is is an ontological concept. It's something that's there virtually. You could even kind of cross over a little bit and use the Baudrillard term irreal or virtual. Virtual is the thing here. It exists virtually, but not actually. But that virtual structure is what produces the actual object.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I mean, you could think of it in a way. Let's use a computer example. So code is the virtual structure. The window in which I'm seeing the software in which I'm viewing this PDF from which I'm reading from is the actual object. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. And the code that's beneath the application is a certain kind of programming language structure that has its own components that are real, but they're virtual. You manipulate and you put together those different components to produce something else. Or even like in the physical arts, your paint, paint is paint. Paint's in this bottle, you put it in an easel, you mix them together, and then you produce something on your canvas, which is something that is made of paint, but it's not paint. Or something else in the plastic arts,
Okay.
As I said, these are the kind of things that when you read it, you're just like, oh, okay, I see what he's getting at. But explaining it to somebody else, it's a challenge.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So continuing on, Jones says, okay, every whole or existing object consists of two complementary yet unequal non-resembling components. One imperceptibly virtual, problematic and ideal, its noumenal structure, and the other actual and empirical, its phenomenal expression. Okay, so we're retaining a Kantian distinction here. This reflects the fact that for Deleuze, quote, reality consists of two different and asymmetrical yet related sides or halves, rather than two different worlds as Plato proposed. Together, these two halves make up an objective experience in its entirety, but only one half, the virtual, and its corresponding transcendental field provides its sufficient reason, its internal difference or differential. Okay?
Okay.
So unlike with Plato, where you have a physical world and you have an other world, where the physical world is just a manifestation of what the other world is, you have
Right.
phenomenal and noumenal using the Kantian distinctions, and then the noumenal is the virtual. The virtual provides the grounds, the sufficient condition for which the phenomenal emerges.
Okay.
And it's a difference or differential. Okay, not two distinct things. Again, differentials.
Right. Varying degrees of difference.
Right, varying degrees
Right.
of difference. Okay,
Right.
so moving right along, the section difference and the differential unconscious. Okay. So Jones continues on page 123. He says, Deleuze acknowledges that concepts and intuitions have a common origin, but not one in which intuitions are revealed to be confused concepts. For both elements originate from the side of the virtual. Now, confused concepts is echoing back to Maimon. For both elements originate from the side of the virtual. from within ideas as the rules of their production, with issues of obscurity and distinctness, confusion and clarity now marking the relation between virtual and actual, differentiation and differentiation, and not the relationship of intuition and concept, or sensibility and understanding. Okay.
Okay.
So again, the virtual and the real distinction here.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay, so we will conclude with this last long paragraph. This is on page 124. Jones says, returning to Maimon, we see that Deleuze is prepared to accept a distinction between finite consciousness and something a priori and transcendental, but on the proviso that we do not conceive of the latter in terms of unity or understanding or a cogito, against Descartes. Despite his own prioritizing of synthesis and the unconscious differential relation, Maimon's ontological account of infinite understanding teeters uncertainly on the edge of a model of identity. Fair point. Yes, it describes differentials and synthesizing ideas. And yes, the infinite understanding is subconscious, immanent, and genetic. But ultimately, it still privileges elements, concepts, and understanding that potentially threaten the integrity of the entire philosophical edifice. Moreover, it remains inconsistent and unclear concerning to what degree infinite understanding is self-reflexive, to what degree it is an I analogous to consciousness and merely universalized in its scope. This ambiguity marks the two different paths that follow from it. One path was taken by the German idealists Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, who saw in the notion of infinite understanding the possibility of the transcendental subject, or cogito, simply writ large, thus replacing the plurality of such subjects with a single all-encompassing I in which everything was ultimately or potentially united. That's idealism. Whilst the other path, different and less traveled, was taken by Deleuze. In this later odyssey, implicit throughout difference and repetition, and virtually threaded throughout its every word and concept, infinite thought remains unconscious in its most important sense, not as a universal mind, but a purely differential, structural unconscious of ideas, devoid of the self-reflective unity ascribed to it by Kant, no longer characterized by the purified, complete understanding of Maimon, and divorced from the substantive, repressed alter ego reified by Freud in his worst moments. Instead, just an immanent virtual multiplicity, both ideal and real, differentiated and differentiated, that structures and systematizes all of these elements without constituting a center, a pure genetic thought of the undetermined, the determinable, and the determined, the idea of ideas.
Okay.
Did you get all that?
That's yeah, I like that that what they said about the idea of the ideas. But
right.
that gets really complex when where they talk about people like Hegel and Freud too.
Right. So just quickly going over those, what he's pointing out is, from Kant afterwards, you have the German idealists. So with this this transcendental unity of apperception, which really was just a principle that Kant came up with to explain about synthesizing perceptions, the idealists took it one step further and said, whatever this transcendental subject is, there's no such thing as an individual I. Everything is just one.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So you and I don't have a distinct mind. We don't have distinct eyes. We're part of this all-encompassing ideal, whatever it could be.
Okay.
That's one definition of idealism. But Deleuze, what he did is that he was avoiding that. He was avoiding Kant. He was avoiding the purified, complete understanding of Maimon, because although it was a way for Maimon to avoid the problems that Kant had set up, still he had his own problems with that. And then with Freud and the repressed alter ego, okay, the subconscious, you could even say.
Okay.
That's what was paramount. So just an immanent virtual multiplicity. The idea as the multiplicity, it exists, but it's unconditioned, and it's what was the term they use? Is virtual. Okay.
Right.
The structure from which other ideas result, and those ideas in turn producing actual objects.
Okay.
Okay. Pure genetic thought of the undetermined, the determinable, and the determined,
Okay.
as Jones says. And that's it. So we have finished Solomon Maimon. Now, what we had taken from Maimon is again the differentials, becoming, avoiding the traps that Kant had set and that he fell into. Maimon as a fellow traveler, as a criticism of Kant.
Okay.
But, again, what the main thing you could say that Kant had pulled from Maimon is the differentials. Maimon was one of the few at the time to focus on the differentials by going back to Leibniz.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
That's it.
Okay.
Questions? Concerns?
Well, I think maybe as usual with these complex philosophical episodes, it would be good for you to do a bit of a recap.
Right. So I've already did kind of a recap right there.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Is that Maimon understood Kant, but he was critical of Kant. Okay.
Yeah.
Because Kant's problems were the dualism of sensibility and understanding. Maimon was trying to get away from that, saying that sensibility was just confused thought, that everything he was basically becoming a rationalist and going back to Leibniz. Also about perception is that there's not one thing about perception. These are small perceptions that are going on subconsciously underneath consciousness. In
Right.
the end, what it is all about differentiation, the infinitesmals, again, what we took from Leibniz. This is what undergirds perception, that there's all kinds of, that there is perception that is going on, from perception itself is constitutive, you could even say. It's not,
Right.
it's against the given. Here's something to my consciousness that is given to me in all of its glory, self-contained.
Right.
That's not what Maimon is going for. Rather, the constitutive elements, something is going on underneath. Deleuze taking it a step further, focusing on the differentials, the idea, the capital I. So the Kantian idea, just like he had said with the Platonic idea, is actually undergirded with difference instead of an identity. Again, avoiding an identity. But with Maimon, as Jones had pointed out, is that even though Maimon is moving away from Kant, he still is dangerously treading into territory where it could be constituted as an identity. And Deleuze pulls away from that, rather focusing on difference, the infinitesimals, virtual, introduction of the virtual. It is real. It's not actual, but it's virtual. It is real. And
real in the way that like money is real or something like that.
Yeah, or like virtual reality.
Yeah.
That's another way to look at it. It is a reality. It's virtual. It doesn't actually exist, but you can operate within virtual reality.
Yeah.
Okay. And, what also Jones had pointed out with Deleuze and what he said about reality is that reality is constituted of two halves, the phenomenal and the noumenal. The noumenal is what gives rise to the phenomenal.
Right.
Okay.
Right. That's the idea in itself, or the object in itself.
Well, the noumena is the thing in itself. That's a Kantian notion.
Right.
And that engendered all kinds of problems because, as scholars have pointed out, depending on your interpretation, is that was the noumenon, did Kant say the noumenon was something actual, existing out there, or was it something internal? Was it a conceptual apparatus that we use to explain how is it that we have a perception or a phenomenon of this, because it's best to explain this too. There's the objective reality, but we are limited because we can only perceive. We're stuck with our senses. There's no, we're not, what's the word I'm looking for? We're not some kind of a guru or, we don't have this unmediated type of experience of reality. We're stuck with our senses.
We don't have a transcendental and infinitesimal understanding.
Well, I wouldn't say transcendental. It's more of a it's this kind of thing, the problem with reality. Do we have an unmediated experience connection with reality? Yes or no?
Right.
That's an important question. Kant said no, because we're mediated by the senses. And that's it. That's my recap.
All right.
So this was a little bit challenging. It's because Kant himself is challenging, and then to get a critic of Kant who is equally challenging.
Yeah.
And then what does Deleuze pull from this? Okay, so we've done this, and then next time we're going to really do something that's challenging, and that is Hegel.
Oh, yeah.
What does Deleuze have to say about Hegel?
A lot,
Tune
I'm
in
sure.
next time
Right.
on Deleuze-ional. Okay, that's all I got.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, that was illuminating as usual. I feel like I understand Solomon Maimon a hell of a lot better, and including Kant a little bit better, which I'm understanding a little bit better all the time. But like you said, he's confused. I'm endlessly confused by him still as well, and
Yeah,
it's a I'm starting to understand better, like sort of what to expect from Deleuze's critiques or thoughts on specific philosophers, like his idea of immanence in terms of this one, for example, and
right.
his philosophy of difference is always prominent as well.
Yeah,
Which is,
because we
yeah,
we see the same terms popping up again and again.
yeah,
Immanence, virtual, multiplicity, differentials, now
yeah,
infinitesmals. Really for Deleuze, it's really a matter of the virtual and matters of degree.
yeah,
That's one way to look at it. Against identity, identity is a matter of differential. Identity is more difference is primary is prior to well, can't speak. Difference is before identity.
right.
Identity is constitutive. Identity is not solid, unchanging. There it is.
Identity is becoming.
Identity is becoming. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Which, again, they don't make sense at first, but when you sit with them, you think, well, yeah, my own identity is becoming because I'm making myself every day and changing myself every day. I don't have a fixed identity.
exactly.
We covered this earlier on, but it doesn't apply just to individual human beings, persons. It also applies to actual objects.
Yeah, exactly.
And then with the idea of the ideas, or just the idea itself, is the grounding of the multiplicity that from which the actual object emerges. Why? It's because it is the structure that's behind it that creates it, but also you could even say, although Deleuze doesn't quite go in this direction, is that we ourselves constitute reality.
Yeah,
Kant
yeah,
would say definitely we constitute reality with the categories of the understanding.
yeah,
But Deleuze doesn't go that far because, as Jones pointed out about this, is that even the categories of understanding are the objects of reason. Reason. See, that was the thing that others have pointed out about Kant, is that Kant seemed to uncritically accept. Here's the way the mind works. Here's the description of the mind. Okay, and I know this because of my transcendental deduction.
right.
Okay. But the problem he runs into is that somebody could point to them and they say, well, how did you come up with these categories? How did you come
Yeah,
up with the furniture of the mind from which you describe? Was that not maybe a creation of your mind?
yeah,
Big question mark.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
All
So
right.
that's all I got, Andrew.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks again. As always, and that was really fascinating and complex as always too.
Hmm.
And yeah, looking for the next one. That one on Hegel will be very interesting because he's of course a very seminal philosopher.
Yes.
And yeah, I'll just say all the stuff I like to say at the end of my videos here, and then you can give any last words there. So yeah, thanks everyone so much for watching this episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Hope you found this deep dive into philosophy as fascinating and educational as I did. And like I always say, thanks to everyone who subscribes to my channel and likes and shares this video, and especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. Really appreciate that, and it means a lot to me. And I'll add the link for my Patreon page to the description for this video, like I always do. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right, keep having mindgasms, everyone. And any last words there, Tim?
Yes, use busts of philosophers as your avatar.
Yes, good idea. I don't know which one I would use.
Oh, you got lots to choose from.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks again, and thanks everyone, and adios until next time.